Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here, and I would like to request from the audience to turn their microphones off. We are back with the second virtual roundtable in the Realism Research Program series. And the organizers are very excited to have organized this roundtable because the coming American presidential election on November 5th and the way foreign policy choices and security governance will be developed subsequently after January 20th, 2025, will have great ramifications, not only for the USA domestically and internationally, but also for its allies, such as its transatlantic partners, turbulent regions, such as the MENA region, the resilience of international institutions to survive and their effectiveness to promote or not collective action and international stability and cooperation to tackle transnational issues and manage international conflict, volatile international markets, energy, climate, and food insecurity, and global shocks. And also specific nation states such as Israel, Iran, China, Russia, Ukraine, but also the whole world. Therefore, the research program on the theory and practice of international relations at the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens, in collaboration with the Association of International Politics and Security Studies INTPOLSEC in Turkey, and the Department of Political Science at the Justus Liebig University, Giessen in Germany, have collaborated once again to organize this timely web event that we hope everybody will find interesting and enlightening. The title, of course, as you know, of our event is Theorizing Neoclassical Realism, U.S. Foreign Policy after November 5th, 2024. We are excited to explore the theory and practice frontier once again by focusing this time on the latest innovation in the Realist Research Program and critically assessing its capacity to explain international phenomena and foreign policy and security processes, neoclassical realism. I'm personally extremely honored as moderator to host a stellar roundtable with distinguished scholars who need, of course, no introduction. Professor Richard Ned Lebow, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at King's College London and Pembroke College at the University of Cambridge, Professor Knud Erik Jørgensen, Professor Emeritus at Aarhus University, Dr. Gideon Rose, Distinguished Fellow in the U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, former editor of Foreign Affairs and adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University, and the scholar who is considered the father of neoclassical realism, Dr. Michiel Foulon, a senior researcher on U.S. grant strategy towards China and European grant strategy at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zürich, and Dr. Feng Zhang, a non-resident senior fellow at the Tsinghua University Center of International Security and Strategy, and visiting scholar at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale University. Thank you all very much for accepting our invitation, and we're looking forward to your insights. Of course, we are also hosting 5 important theorists, scholars who serve as discussants. Professor Alexander Reichwein, senior lecturer, in the Department of Political Science at Justus Liebig University, Giessen, Professor Bezen Balamir, professor at TED University and president of INTPOLSEC, Professor Ferid Asli Ergul Jørgensen, associate professor at Yale University, Professor Carmen Chas Bartolomé, a researcher at Comillas Pontifical University, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if you are a professor, and I apologize for this, and Professor Mateusz Filari Panik, assistant professor at the Jesuit University Ignatiadum in Krakow. I would also like to express my gratitude and special thanks to the organizing committee for making this virtual roundtable possible again, with whom I collaborated closely to organize it. Alexander Reichwein, Bezen Balamir, Ferid Asli Ergul Jørgensen, and Professor Haralambos Tsardanidis. Just to give you an outline of what we're going to do today, the 5 roundtable participants will have 8 to 10 minutes each to make their case. Then the 5 discussants have approximately 5 minutes each to discuss and pose questions to the roundtable participants. And then we're going to have a discussion between the discussant and the roundtable participants and debate. Depending on the time, maybe this will be the first round, and then I will allow for short questions and interventions by the audience, and then we're going to have a second round. And we're definitely, this time, we're going to allocate at least 20 minutes, if not 30, to the audience, and especially to the students, in order to pose their questions and comments to the participants. So without further ado, I turn it to Professor Richard Ned Lebow. Thank you very much, Professor Lebow. The floor is yours.
Microphone is muted, sir.
Thank you very much. I turned it off not to make any noise while Effie was talking, and then I forgot to turn it back on. As this meeting is focused on neoclassical realism, I think you should ask first the neoclassical realists to make their presentations. I will be very happy to respond toward the end to give them the first shot at laying out their views.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lebow. So I have no choice but to start with Professor Gideon Rose. He's the most expert in this round table to give us his insights and how he came up with the idea of neoclassical realism and how he explored it in the foreign policy processes.
Thank you very much, Effie. Thank you, Ned, and thank all of you. So I want to take you back to the 1980s and early 1990s, because what was happening then in the field of IR was that there were, as an attempt to make it a social science, a very scientific social science, and in addition to advances in methods and sophisticated methodology, there was also an attempt to follow higher level social science, intellectual methodology. Everybody was talking about Lakatos and research programs, and the idea was find a big theoretical framework that explained everything and lay out the principles, and then you could work within that. And since there were different schools that proposed different overarching theories, different grand paradigms, the idea was to turn those paradigms into testable frameworks that could be set against one another, and we could figure out which was actually the correct place to start. And in this context, it was when I was in grad school, and others were here, some of them are here, remember this, there was a big set of battles, primarily between realism and liberalism, which were seen to go from different premises. Constructivism came on as well, and you ended up getting these big paradigm wars. And the idea was, what is the best place to start, and how do we create a macro framework for understanding international relations? It was clear to my generation of young realists, as it were, or young people in the security studies and IR field, that realism had a lot of insights, that power mattered, that the distribution of power mattered. But it was also clear that the simplistic neo-realist framework was not sufficient by itself. And rather than jump off realism entirely to some other framework to start with, or stay narrowly within the confines of neo-realism, a spare Waltzian version of it, and say, this is the only thing that matters, what a number of scholars started to do was to, in effect, take elements from different theories and layer them on, or different frameworks, and layer them on top of one another in a kind of syncretic framework. And the idea, and this is how the origin of neoclassical realism came about, which is there were several scholars who started with what they thought was the basic realist insight about power in the system and the distribution of power in the system, and that being the place to start because it trumped everything else. And yet it was not, if it started with realism, it didn't end with realism, because there was a sense that realism by itself did not give sufficient credit to other factors that mattered and didn't provide a good explanation for the way details of things actually played out. And so a number of scholars started to do research that began in realism, but added other variables, domestic level variables, individual level variables, other kinds of concepts that fleshed out the realist framework and made it perhaps less parsimonious, but gave much better fit. And the feeling was that given the way the world actually worked, this was probably a better way of doing things. And so the neoclassical realists, and I coined the term neoclassical realism in a review essay of the work of several of these scholars, everybody from Fareed Zakaria, who talked about the rise of the state, the extractive state in the United States, to explain the puzzle of why an America which had become extremely powerful in realist terms by the early second half of the 19th century had not started to act in that way for another half a century. And he argued at the state. There were Tom Christensen, Randy Schweller, Aaron Freeberg, a variety of other scholars talked about realist frameworks, but and added other variables on. And so I called this term, by the way, for those might be interested, I originally termed the school soft realism. And this was my actual introduction to the value of feminist theory, because when we did a panel at APSA presenting this, and I called it soft realism, all the other guys in the camp, who at that point were guys, Jennifer hadn't come along and others hadn't come along to have female neoclassical realists, they all cringed at the notion of soft realism. And you could almost see them covering their crotch as if, oh my God, soft realism, I don't want to be that. And so we ended up renaming it neoclassical realism. And I realized that was the time when I first realized, okay, the feminists are actually onto something. Young men do not like to be called soft, and it has nothing to do with their gut. It has to do with other kinds of things. Anyway, that was kind of an interesting theory. What neoclassical realism said very simply was that realism is a hedgehog theory in Isaiah Berlin's terms. It knows one thing, but it's a big one. And that big one is power. And if you go back to Thucydides' classic line in the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. And the argument here was this is just a basic fact of international life that has been the case for millennia. And if you don't start from there, you will not understand what actually happens, because you will overestimate constraint when it comes to great powers, and you will underestimate constraint when it comes to weak powers. And that what the thing you should look at first and foremost is not just the distribution of power in the system, which sets the envelope curve for states' foreign policies, but also the changes in that distribution of power. However, in order to understand how changes in the distribution of power actually play out and how actual foreign policies are made, you have to look inside the black box to other factors that permeate and mediate the system. And that basic framework was it was an attempt to push off both against the realists who thought you could only do everything with power, and the non-realists who felt you should jump off power to something else as your starting point, and the methodologists who felt you could actually build a very hard, predictable, clear, kind of simple framework for explaining things. And the feeling was, no, you have to start with realism, but layer on other things, that the other things are important, but not the place to start, and that you're never going to get the kind of precision that classic social science at that time had hoped for. And I think those basic tenets, even though the field hasn't necessarily incorporated them, remain absolutely valid. And they're actually a wonderful framework for explaining American foreign policy going forward. Why do I say this? First of all, I will put in the comments in the chat after my presentation, a piece I did for Foreign Affairs in the spring, reviewing Steve Cole's new book on the Iraq War. And it's a good example of what I would consider neoclassical realist analysis, because it talks about how Iraq has to be understood as a realist problematique, all sorts of realist factors going in, but then you have to add on all sorts of other psychological factors because both Saddam and the Bush administration were completely clueless about how each other saw the world, and to understand why Iraq was a problem and how the nature of that problem was presented itself, you have to understand classic realism in all sorts of straightforward power ways. But in order to understand why the war actually happened and happened as it did, you have to layer in more specific psychological factors on both sides. So I'll put that in as an example. I think very briefly, just to wrap up, to not take too much time, the same thing is going to be true going forward. What will happen on November 5th will not affect American power in classic realist terms. The United States will be as strong or as weak, as capable or as incapable on November 6th or January 30th as it was on November 4th. But what will change will be the mindset of the people in charge of American power, maybe. And if that happens, then there will be a change in American foreign policy. And so in order to understand the role that the United States plays in the world, you still have to start from the place that the United States is this dominant power, whether it's still a unipole, whether it's whatever, it's still the strongest power in the world, even though it's dropped down. But in order to understand how that is going to manifest and the issues that incredibly strong power will need to deal with are still classic realist issues of power and war and capabilities. But in order to understand what it does on those issues, you will have to look inside the black box to the particular people in charge of American foreign policy and what they think. And let me also just say that that applies to Germany as well. If you look at what's happening in Germany and European foreign policy more general, you have a large, powerful actor, both Germany and all of Europe in international affairs. And it has had one philosophy and one approach to operating in the world. And then you get a classic realist dynamic, an aggressive power attack somebody right near you, and it produces a Zeitenwende. And it produces a change, just like realists would say, oh, a big guy attacks you, then you'll respond by feeling threatened, changing some of your power into capabilities in order to respond to this. However, you have to understand not just the psychology, but also the institutional details of Europe to understand how the Zeitenwende is playing out and what are the obstacles in its way. And so the basic dynamic is one of classic realism, or realism per se, but that in order to understand how that's playing out, what the obstacles in the way are, why the transition, why the Zeitenwende is so difficult and will maybe not achieve what it initially wanted and why it's slowing down, you have to look at all sorts of institutional and psychological factors inside Germany and Europe that are outside the old-fashioned simple neo-realist framework. And so, but if you layer those on to a basic realist framework, you can get a much richer, fuller understanding of what's going on. And so that's all I'll say. I'll shut up now and turn it over. But the idea was, if you properly understand the various different theories, instead of thinking of them as purely competitive theories or thinking that you could only do one, or that you should just be completely and totally eclectic, the idea was start with one of the biggest ones, realism, because of power and its role in the system, but then layer on in some coherent, logical way other factors to help you answer the kinds of questions that you want to answer.
Thank you, Professor Rose. Should I invite Professor Reichwein into the discussion? I think at this point, you are the right person to intervene.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Hello, everybody.
And the reason I know that you are a discussant, but the reason I'm inviting you is I'm following Professor Lebow's advice. And as a neoclassical realist, maybe we can do it this way, and then we will have a reaction by the classical realists and maybe a liberal scholar here.
Okay, first of all, I'm very happy to have you all here on a Saturday afternoon, at least in Germany. Hello, everybody, again. I suggest the following. I made a lot of notes, and I have also some questions to Gideon, but I fear that if I start now with my questions, we have a kind of dialogue, which will take us a couple of minutes. So I suggest to go on in the order of the speakers. And it was very beneficial, Ned. I think it was your aim and your task and your objective to start with Gideon as the father of neoclassical realism, giving this very brief summary of the history and the aim those days to have something new. Let's call it soft realism part, whatever. And at the end, you ended up with some ideas about what happens after November 5th. And so we have a very good introduction, in my understanding, to go on with maybe Ned at the end of the list, because he can maybe give us some ideas from a classical realist perspective on the topic. And then I suggest to start with a discussion, roll people, and then I'm happy to start first, because my first question would be a question to Gideon. Is it okay?
Of course, but the reason I invited you is because I know that you are very much preoccupied with neoclassical realism, yes. And in the panel, the person who is a veritable neoclassical realist is Professor Gideon Rose. So I was wondering if you would like to make just a couple of statements about what neoclassical realism is all about, in order to help the following speakers in the roundtable, to react, because most of them are classical realists.
Thank you. Let me just give three very brief one comment and two questions, which should intellectually provoke all the audience, and also Gideon and the other guys. I mean, I do not have to add something here on the history of neoclassical realism, the context behind. Most people are very familiar with this. Others can read a lot of articles about the history of neoclassical realism, though that's really fine, and I think most of the people know about the history and the idea behind the neoclassical realism. I just have one comment and two questions. The first question, Gideon, is after November 5th, at the 6th of November, at the 11th of January, in March 2028, there will be no change of US power capabilities and the distribution of power, and also of the role of the US in the world. So it doesn't matter whether Camilla or Donald will be elected as a president. From a realist perspective, it just doesn't matter, because there is power, and there is a role and power capabilities, and there is a distribution of power, and the US will not end up the next day at rank number 345 when it comes to the power capabilities of states. So I got it right. And the second question is that you rather argue that there will be a change of the perception of the US, a change of the mindset. What should European allies think about the either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump administration, and so on and so forth. So this is rather a cognitive argument, which is absolutely in line with the neoclassical realist agenda of having liberal or domestic and also cognitive or constructivist variables or factors explaining the US foreign policy at the one hand, and also the reaction of other states towards US foreign policy. And then I would make one comment. I'm not sure, and this is something we can discuss later, whether the US power capabilities will be the same, because when there is a wrong economic policy by, for example, the Trump or the Harris administration, and if there is another war by which the US is maybe concerned, and maybe the US will intervene under the Harris administration rather than under the Trump administration in a foreign conflict, then it has maybe consequences for the US power capabilities, doesn't it? This is my first question.
Thank you, Alec. Yes, please. No, Professor Rose, please.
I'll just say something very, very simple. So, and this gets to the point that Cornelia made in the comments also. So realists start with power. And many realists just stay with power, and that's all. They start and end with power. But the neoclassical realists, at least our version of it, felt that you had to start with power, because if you didn't have, the strong do what they can, weak do what they must. If you don't have the power, you don't have the opportunity. But if you do have the power, you can do various different things. And the neoclassical realists started with power because the strong do what they can, but precisely because they have the choice to do what they can, you have to layer on other variables after power to understand why they will do the kind of things they want. And so the United States will have the same amount of power capabilities under Trump and Harris, but they will choose to use them in different ways. And that's why you have to look not just at the power capabilities, but also at the other factors involved.
Okay, thank you very much. I thought that this exchange was very useful because these are the two primary neoclassical realists we have in this roundtable, and this will set the tone for the following discussion. So now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Michiel Foulon, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon also from here, from me in Belgium at the moment, where I'm. Thank you so much, Effie, and all of you for attending and for the opportunity to talk. My discussion or my comments in the coming minutes will be, I believe, as opposed to Professor Rose's opening comments, mine will be more surgical in the terms of, I was also recently reading some research on the life cycles of theories. That there's an inception and emergence phase, a development phase, a maturity phase, and so forth. And as you move on the life cycle, then the interventions of theories become more surgical. So I think that's maybe the context in which my notes will take place. So when I was thinking about the topic for today, about the US November 5th elections, I'm always thinking about this in terms of like changing continuity, and my comments will be in line of my book that's coming out next year about US balancing towards China's rise and the notions of power perception and permissiveness. And on the one hand, also based on my experience as a European, I'm always interesting to see how much the differences are being stressed, obviously, in the debates within the US about polarization between the Democrats and the Republicans, and how much significant the change would be, and so on. And I remember a documentary a long time ago by Oliver Stone, who was doing an interview with non-Western leaders, and he asked one at that time, what do you think about the election of Barack Obama? And the non-Western leader's response was, it's a US president, which raised for me kind of questions about saying, what is the level of continuity, whoever gets selected in this kind of election, what is the level of change of there? Of course, the first point, of course, to make is that the level of change would also be significant just in a matter of style and also in a manner of means that would be used to achieve particular strategic ends on the longer term, like foreign policy ends. So the means would be, on the one hand, more confrontational, more unilateral, perhaps, or more cooperative and more multilateral. For example, trade disputes being solved through unilateral means like tariffs and a trade conflict, or more through the multilateral means of the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism. Also the language and so on, and the normative chart. There will be, of course, a number of things that would change, of course, a lot. And also, I think for allies, and in the case of Europe here, it is very interesting to see how these debates have moved on over the recent years. When it comes to NATO, for example, transatlantic security collaboration, hearing today talks about, in the extremist version, the leaving NATO discussion. And on the one hand, many recall, of course, still the 3 Ds from Secretary Albright in the 1990s of no decoupling as a condition for Europe in its security and military development. So it's always interesting to see how much will change and what the differences there will be depending on who is being elected. So on the one hand, and continuing on the empirical level of discussion before I go to more some of the theoretical things that thinking about answering those things is, of course, the levels of continuity. And we can, of course, think about also President Obama, President Biden pressing Europe to spend more on defense, just as President Trump did, although the emphasis has been much more on the latter in these debates. Of course, it was also in different ways and in different styles. But there's also a level of continuation, of course, on pressing Europe on to do more on these debates. The examples of also President Biden at the time when he was still running against Donald Trump for the presidency, also in the campaign, even saying that the tariffs would be maintained that the Trump administration imposed. So there's many ways how we can also, of course, think about levels of continuity just by looking at some of the empirics and some of the data points there. And also going back in the history, and I think that's part of the starting point to think about what the elections may hold for the future, is looking at the long-term historical trends. For example, the US withdrawal of hundreds of thousands of troops from Europe in the early 1990s, but not per se to the same levels in East Asia, by the fact that a withdrawal on one hand occurred from Europe, but not so much from Asia, by itself can be seen already as a longer-term kind of refocus or a longer-term trend in what was going on. Then, of course, there is the longer-term trend of the so-called reorientation towards the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, whatever the exact starting point is of this reorientation. As we know, some pointed towards the middle 2000s, as in the pivot before the pivot piece in international security. There's a book by Michael Green also points this changing point around the mid 2000s. Some say, well, the US changed really more after President Obama gave his famous speech before the Australian Parliament, and Secretary Clinton published a piece in Foreign Policy on the pivot. But whatever the starting point is around that particular time, of course, we can look at these kind of longer changes as well. And obviously, many of these things will continue, whatever the election will be. And some of the more in the current and more contentious things about, for example, dual-use technology, looking at some of the archives of the Bill Clinton administration, we also find there already a lot of concern about trading dual-use technologies with China. So many of those things that we see today are much more polarized, are becoming much more higher on the agenda and so forth. But of course, we see also longer trends over the past few decades that may suggest some kind of level of continuity and may also point towards something there. And then I think that's when the question comes in about theory, and of course things like neoclassical realism is how do I explain those things? And then of course moving towards some more complexity for more accuracy of a particular shift in foreign policy or a grand strategy. And then I think that's very interesting points, of course, from neoclassical realists come in, and as also Professor Rose introduced, with starting with the more parsimonious Waltzian understanding of power and anarchy, and then adding a layer of complexity to explain more accurate things. That's, I think, very interesting point here comes in. So my more specific intervention that I worked on, and also for the book that's coming out next year, is there's been a lot of debate over the past, let's say, 30 years since the article in World Politics about adding the proliferation of variables, which of course raised also a lot of criticism. It's too much ad hoc, and also I'm not addressing that per se. We can only tackle one problem at a time on the theory debate. But one interesting challenge that I found in this debate is to say, well, we got so many variables now in this framework of neoclassical realism. And the question is the temporality of causal mechanisms. So jumping now from a very empirical thing to a more like theoretical thing. And the best metaphor I found myself is you have to really say when over time which of these variables matters more and when which matters less. And I found myself it is very often lacking in neoclassical realist work. And this goes, I think, also in some of the neoclassical realist publications, like the 2016 book by Jeff and Stephen and Norrin. There's also a sentence in saying, well, one of the chief challenges for the current generation of neoclassical realists is to spell out this temporality of causal mechanisms. And also in the IR discipline more general, in European Journal of International Relations and elsewhere, you find similar questions about this temporal scope of explanations. And I found this to be a very crucial one as a step forward with saying, how do we go about that? Because you can't say that everything matters all the time to the same extent, all of those variables. That would be like saying that, just like in a food recipe, is a metaphor I could come up with. You can't say all ingredients for a food recipe, but all the time to the same extent, because that kind of beats the purpose of food recipes and theories and probably leads to disasters. I'm thinking now more in the case of food recipes. But the point there is you should be able to say over time, also by seeing theory as a guide for behavior and for policy prescription, when things matter more, which variable matters more, domestic interest groups, free trade lobby groups, and so forth, the misperception points, and so forth, when these things matter more and when they matter less, and when foreign policy is driven more by international factors, like balance of power, distribution of power, anarchy, and then more by which particular domestic and intervening variables. So that I think was an interesting one to look at this. And that is an interesting concept that has been pointed towards in the neoclassical realist literature of the last 10 or something years, which is called the permissiveness or the nature of the international strategic environment. And at the first time I saw this was in the 2012 book on grand strategy, also edited by Jeff Norin and Stephen, with a chapter by Dave Copeland, and he was pointing there towards this notion. This was picked up again, this notion of permissiveness of the international environment in the 2016 book, Neoclassical Realist Theory of International Politics. And that was a suggestion there as a potential future avenue for explaining better, well, depending on the permissiveness of the international environment, so whether security is scarce or abundant, domestic factors may have more room to intervene in a foreign policy process or less room to intervene in that foreign policy process. So far in my reading of the literature, so I found as much as I could about the use of permissiveness, but there was not really a development of how would that kind of concept really work. So I've worked on that for the past few years, and that's going to be the theory part of the book as such. And then I found that the first thing to start in this question is to define really what permissiveness really means, but the permissiveness of the national strategic environment. And those, of course, also working with some of the more structural realist works, may of course realize that there is a bit of a confusion of terms sometimes, also, that realists haven't made it themselves very easy by talking about the permissive cause of conflict in the Walesian sense of anarchy and the permissiveness of the international strategic environment. So I think the first thing there is to do is to disentangle how these two different terms relate in the neoclassical realist explanation. Then I think, of course, the permissive cause of anarchy in a Walesian sense is more like a constant. Because of the constant uncertainty that comes from anarchy, then we have the logic of the need to defend yourself and defend your material interest and so on. But the permissiveness, on the other hand, of the security environment could then be seen as more something of a continuum. That an international strategic environment can become more permissive in one period, where security is more abundant, let's say for the US and for Europe in the 1990s and 2000 to some extent, and less permissive or more restrictive or more threatening in a different period. And at this continuum, if we find a way to measure how an international environment becomes more or less permissive, we can also be more specific on when domestic factors have more room to sometimes interfere and sometimes distort a foreign policy or a grand strategy. And then, of course, it is not the place to elaborate on the specific measurement. So having dealt with the meaning, so what permissiveness means, it becomes a matter, of course, of measuring this thing. Then you can come up with, and that's something also for an upcoming article in the review and for the book, is to specify a clear set of criteria prior to doing the case analysis by saying what are the criteria that would make, what behavioral implications would I need to see for an environment to become more or less permissive. And then you can think about, for example, the rhetoric that this particular state leader is using from a rising power, the particular movement of troops, the use of tariffs and so forth, any type of behavior that you can think about deductively, what may indicate to other actors that the environment will be more or less permissive. And I think once you have this kind of established criteria, and there's of course more in the book and in the article, then you have a kind of a guiding tool to say, okay, based on these criteria, we can look more when an environment becomes more or less permissive, and thus also more or less open to domestic or individual factors to interfere in the policymaking process, whether it's resource extractive capacity, whether it's the role of perception and so on. So that would be the kind of a way to more kind of guide this kind of behavior. And in the case of, for example, and of course then the question is, once we have a bit of an idea that in a more permissive environment, maybe there is more room for a so-called luxury strategy that allows more role for distraction of the balancing target, that maybe we have more of a role for lobby groups to interfere, for more role for misperceptions and so forth to occur. And in a less permissive environment, there may be less room for this, and grand strategy tends to go more towards balancing and being less interfered or distorted by this kind of domestic and individual factors. But that's, I think, an interesting both theoretical, if you will, intervening, but also perhaps a meta-theoretical one about temporality, and when the more material balance of power things matter more, and when some of the intervening ones, some are material, but also some variables more immaterial, ideation like perception, when which of those factors matter more and when they matter less in distorting foreign policy. So having this kind of suggestion for a new tool to look at foreign policy or grand strategy. Of course, I mentioned the two terms now sometimes at the same time. Of course, a clear distinction between the two, longer term, shorter term, and so on. But once we have this, the question, of course, means what would it suggest for US foreign policy also after the election. So, of course, one expectation would be that the US would in any way continue to focus and increase its balancing efforts against balancing China's rise in Asia Pacific. The question about balancing China's rise, of course, by itself, that would be then the empirical puzzle to be resolved. Of course, is an interpretation of reality by itself, and that's maybe a different question: is whether the US has been over or under balancing against China's rise. And I'm suggesting this kind of double interpretation because last year at ISA there was somebody sitting next to me because my book is about the challenges for the US to balance China's rise, and a person next to me was having a question about overbalancing, for example, by the maintenance of a number of US troops and military bases post-Cold War already at the stages when, for example, China was much still a peasant country. So my question is that on one hand, of course, there's been a number of elements of significant balancing, for example, in the forward deployment of military troops, but you can also say if balancing is supposed to be an increased and continuous focus on a particular region and actor, that of course the example of Iraq that also Professor Rose referred to in the opening comments could be seen at least as some elements that distorted ideal balancing, if you will, the attention, the time, the resource, and so on being spent in that particular area of the world. So if you look at then this kind of question of balancing more or less, for me, I point a change somewhere in the mid to late 2000s of a shift away from the 1990s, early 2000s, more engagement policies and towards more of a realization that this didn't really work out as anticipated, that China didn't really change as was anticipated, what the engagement policy would have or should have been brought. This, of course, is also part of a different story of the wider realization in the West, also in Europe and in the EU, that the EU neighborhood policy, particularly in the East, didn't really yield results of the engagement, what they expected over there. But then if we would take, for example, the mid-2000s as a changing point, then the empirical question, of course, turns to be, why did we see a phase of the 1990s and early 2000s of more engagement policy to China, over the distraction and spending resources and time and so forth in Iraq, which was some would call in a more permissive environment as a more luxury strategy, but then there was more security, security and peace was abundant, and more room for these kind of endeavors. And then why do we see then a shift towards a more of a realization that this didn't really work out, and a shift to more balancing also, for example, in the trade realm and withdrawing troops and so forth from other parts of the world. So that's, I think, what also maybe then be seen as a tool for future policy, that, and maybe this is then maybe a full circle to my opening comments by saying, yes, we may see many more of those things and this future direction for sure continuing. But then again, that's about the broad expectations. Agency and structure, when we bring in, of course, again, the individuals being elected here, the question is, and that's an open question that I don't have an answer to myself yet, is a new reality with the November 5th elections also brings, of course, maybe new questions for some more inductive theorizing. And an interesting question, I think, is, my assumption here is that the style, in my previous few minutes and comments here, that the difference in style would not change the direction of US foreign policy of grand strategy, but more the timing and the shape, which may also be significant. What I don't know the answer to is, can this consequentialism of the style and the shape, depending on who is being elected, can it be so consequential that it also has more broader effects? That I don't know, but that's, I think, an interesting question to think about. So I think I will leave it here for my comments. So I started with this kind of more continuity change things about the November 5th elections, then saying like, hold on, how can we think about NCR, Neoclassical Realism, to think about this in a better way? So I talked about the permissiveness notion, how this may be a good tool, and then saying, okay, this may be a tool to look forward to as a guide for behavior, and talking about future expectations. So I'll leave it here and I look forward to the discussion.
Dr. Foulon, thank you very much. Extremely interesting observations and intervention. I would like to invite in the discussion Professor Jørgensen at this point.
Sorry, there are two Professor Jørgensens. I don't think that you...
Knud Erik.
Okay.
Sorry, Professor Knud Erik Jørgensen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Effie. And thank you to both you and the team for organizing this roundtable. It's really very pleasant to be back after our first attempt. Let me say that I was very happy that we started off with Gideon Rose, and it will become very clear during my presentation why that is the case, because it seems to me that my presentation is very complementary to his. In my brief introduction, I will address what I consider to be maybe attention in the title of the roundtable. On the one hand, theorizing, and on the other hand, the situation in US foreign policy after November the 5th. Actually, it's more than attention. It's an inherent tension in what we tend to do. And therefore, it is worthwhile addressing. I'll try to explain in just 6 steps how the tension came into being. So the first step takes me back to the birth of the discipline. Because if one looks into the origin of the discipline, one will soon find out that there are quite a few debates about the very feasibility of the discipline, if it is possible at all to do what we do. Some argue that the discipline or the subject matter is simply too complex, too comprehensive to allow for theorizing. That was Raymond Aron's take on this. Now, despite these kind of warnings, the founding fathers and mothers simply soldiered on. They moved into uncharted territory and sort of tried out what they could do and could not do. Now, given that we scholars are unable to cover all aspects and perspectives, we need to, at least we cannot cover all these things in one go. We need simply to compartmentalize things. We need to cut up the very complex reality to something that we can comprehend and that we can manage analytically. So among these unintended consequences of this condition is that we find quite a few of what one could call maybe essential gaps. And we also find quite a number of essentially contending perspectives. Exactly as Gideon Rose outlined in his perspective, in his presentation. Now, again, if we look into the development of the discipline, very soon there was a search for general theory of international politics. And it took maybe 10, 15 years to realize, to conclude that this endeavor had to be unsuccessful. At least that is what Carl Holsti concluded in 1970. After all these experiments in trying to develop such a general theory, a catch-all in one go, and there you have it. This is the very complex and comprehensive international reality, and here is the one general theory that explains it all. Unsuccessful. Now, of course, nobody told seemingly Kenneth Walsh that that was the case. So he continued to theorize what became a theory of international politics, with one first draft in 1975, and then the full book 4 years after. And of course, neorealism is eminent to keep first and second images out of the equation. Walsh deliberately created gaps, he created demarcations, and he created contending perspectives. He was very good at that. He focused on what he believed were the crucial factors and concluded that third image theories is simply the superior perspective. Moreover, he did not hide but actually made a deed out of the understanding that his IR theory is not a theory of foreign policy. For that reason, theory of international politics is a theory focusing on factors at the systemic level, structure, polarity, global distribution of power, and balance of power. It was, needless to say in this crowd, but it was parsimonious to the max. And that's one of the derived consequences. It left many scholars unhappy. unhappy because they had made careers of doing foreign policy analysis and such things, and appearing on television as experts on foreign policy, often the foreign policy of the country in which they were situated. Now, after 20 years after the publication of Theory of International Politics, there were happy neorealists, and there were a considerable community of unhappy scholars. In this situation, someone invented neoclassical realism, arguing that theory at the systemic level is good, but so are first and second image theories. The slogan was, let's compromise, let's be pragmatic, let's span the gap between IR and foreign policy analysis. Of course, in this game, timing is of the essence. So I should maybe highlight that neorealism during the 1990s was a besieged theoretical perspective, attacked by a broad coalition of constructivist, post-structuralist, critical scholars of all breeds, and not to forget the strong liberals. So it's probably misleading to talk about a few happy neorealists unless they were happy about all the attention that they received. Now, under the banner of neoclassical realism, all sorts of variables and levels of analysis were given prominence. A realism was given a chance to survive in a very unfriendly atmosphere. The consequences, and I'll outline just three in this context. First of all, the consequence is the production of a very rich collection of studies characterized by neoclassical realist flavors. Sometimes actually it pays off if coherence is sacrificed, if one allows 1,000 flowers to blossom. Second consequence, well, during the 25 years since the invention of neoclassical realism, the features of system-level analysis were largely forgotten, it seems to me. Gideon Rose said that it all begins with power, but it doesn't really, in that many studies, begin with systems-level conceptions, ideas, understanding of the distribution of power at the systems level. I've been looking for quite a few comprehensive studies of the current balance of power as system-level analysis, and I didn't find that much. There was a little bit in T.V. Paul's book from 2004, 20 years ago. There was also some in Ripsman's book from 2016. But again, a structured, focused analysis of the current distribution of power at the international level, system level, I don't find that much. There is all the colors of variables, but not so much what was actually seen as part of the compromise. Let's keep the third image, but let's introduce something else as well. The third image seems to have gone quite consistently. My third conclusion is that then neoclassical realism tends to become a bit of an empty signifier. It's kind of an umbrella under which more or less everything is allowed to happen. That's probably why it's possible to talk about theorizing neoclassical realism today, tomorrow, and also perpetually, because it's basically a discussion where people are walking in circles. There is not the progress that and the advances that EFI asked us to look for, at least not in my understanding or in my search. I might have been not systematic enough or consistent enough in my search, but that is my sort of understanding until I've been told that it's totally wrong. That's also why neoclassical realism often becomes a platform for engaging debates about foreign policy of the country in which a given scholar is situated. And of course, that's a laudable enterprise. There should be some people doing that kind of analysis. It is, it then takes all the particularities of that country into the equation. And then the theorizing aspiration kind of disappears, because that tends to be more general. So again, I do not see the theoretical or methodological advantage that EFI asked us to outline. And that is how I see that lays a certain tension between, on the one hand, theorizing neoclassical realism, and on the other hand, discussing what might happen after November the 5th. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jørgensen. Talking about critically assessing, neoclassical realism. We appreciate your criticism very much. Professor Feng Zhang, Dr. Feng Zhang, the floor is yours.
Right. First of all, many thanks to Effie for inviting me to participate in this roundtable and for allowing me to share my current research on US-China relations without focusing exclusively on neoclassical realism. I have prepared a few simple slides. So let me first share my slides with you. So my approach shares neoclassical realism's emphasis on the importance of leader perception, which is a very important intervening variable for neoclassical realism. But I don't focus on the perception of the material international structure. My current project seeks to explain the making of US-China rivalry over the past decade, but I'm not adopting a neo-realist or power transition approach. My approach can perhaps be called something like a merit transition theory, and it seeks to synthesize the insights of classical Chinese thought, especially Confucianism, in a modern IR and social theory. As I will explain shortly, the Confucian conception of merit incorporates the concept of power, but here power is understood in the relational sense as the ability to get others to do what they otherwise would not, or refrain from doing what they otherwise would. And so is distinct from material capabilities. And because Confucianism acknowledges the role of power, it is not an idealistic doctrine. So perhaps it's possible to call my approach a kind of Confucian realism. I think this approach shares interesting affinities with classical realism in the IR literature. So my assumption is that over the past decade, the US-China relationship has been evolving from one of informal status hierarchy to one of substantive equality, particularly in the Asian region. And I argue that it is such a status transition that has caused the rivalry between the US and China. And this approach locates the cause of rivalry at the level of relationship rather than material capabilities. And it challenges both the power transition theory and the so-called Thucydides trap. I think rather than Thucydides trap, I want to suggest an original Chinese idea. I call it a Xunzi challenge. I think this might be a more revealing metaphor for capturing the challenges facing US-China relations today. Xunzi is Asian China's third great Confucian thinker after Confucius and Mencius. He is an outstanding theorist on ritual and hierarchy. And one of his main argument is that the relationships of equality present unique challenges for cooperation and harmony. And so he argues that it's much easier to achieve social cooperation under the condition of differentiated hierarchy. So to draw on Xunzi here, I think the central challenge for the US-China relationship is to navigate the increasingly equal relationship between the two countries. And this is what I mean by Xunzi challenge. And my central research question is how and under what conditions might status transition generate rivalry. Let me give you a quick introduction to Xunzi's theory of differentiation before moving on to current US-China relations. So Xunzi conceives of three kinds of differentiation in social order: hierarchical, functional, and meritocratic. I want to emphasize the third type, differentiation based on merit. here merit is conceived of as a combination of virtue and ability. It encompasses both ethical quality and practical achievements. So in the Confucian context, this suggests someone who is not only ethically good, but also competent and accomplished. The implication is that meritocratic differentiation is very important because it provides the legitimating mechanism for a differentiated status hierarchy. And it is also a principle of justice, specifically justice understood as fairness. And it holds that one's status and rewards should correspond to one's merit. Now here I'm drawing on my past work with Ned. We wrote 2 books on US-China relations and international justice and order. So applied to hierarchical relationships in international relations, meritocratic differentiation would suggest that in a stable hierarchy, the superior actor is perceived to possess greater merit, justifying their elevated status. And this perception of superior merit helps to legitimize the hierarchical relationship. But when shifts in relative merit erode the legitimacy of the hierarchical relationship, they are likely to trigger status transition. And this is the key implication of Xunzi theory for understanding the mechanism of status transition. And we can develop, at least I'm trying to develop this insight into a deductive theory of merit transition and rivalry. In relationship of status hierarchy between the US and China, I posit perception. Here's the common ground with neoclassical realism. I posit perception of relative merit as an independent variable, and this variable operates on both the Chinese and the US side. In addition, I posit an intervening variable of relational empathy, conceptualized as mutual consideration of each other's interests and needs. And this conception of empathy is drawn from the Confucian concept of shu. So here, perception relative merit is a categorical variable, and it can take 3 values: increasing, decreasing, stable. Relational empathy is a discrete variable, and I assigned it 3 values of high, medium, low. So a full typology will produce 27 outcomes based on all the possible combinations of the independent intervening variables when they take on different values. For illustrative purposes, I highlight 9 most relevant scenarios. As you can see from this table, these are the 9 scenarios when China perceives its merit as increasing relative to that of the US, and so will seek to move up the status ladder. On the US side, there are 3 possibilities. The US may perceive its relative merit, relative China's as increasing, stable, or decreasing. If the US perceives its relative merit as unchanging, scenarios 1 to 3, or as rising, scenarios 7 to 9, this means that it doesn't acknowledge China has gained merit. So it's not likely to agree to a status adjustment. And this will lead to potential conflict. If the US perceives its relative merit as declining, scenarios 4 to 6, a very interesting condition emerges because it may produce 2 distinct outcomes. The first outcome is that if relational empathy is low, the US might develop preventive motivations and try to preserve the existing status hierarchy vis-a-vis China. This is what prospect theory will tell us, and that will potentially lead to conflict. The second possibility is that if relational empathy is high, that is to say, both countries have developed a healthy appreciation of the other's interests and needs and adopt policies accordingly, the US might restrain preventive motivation, accept at least to some degree, its declining status and accommodate China's rising status and growth. And in this scenario, which is scenario 4, a status adjustment may be possible, and this would be an adjustment toward equality. So let me now move on to the current US-China relationship. My hypothesis is that the US-China relationship since the Trump administration has been characterized by China's perception of its increasing relative merit and the US perception of its decreasing relative merit. And China wants to gain more status and greater role for itself, while the US wants to prevent status loss. And when relational empathy is low, the result is escalating rivalry. And what's the implication of this theory for US-China relations going forward? It will point to the understanding of fairness based on relative merit as the critical factor shaping the future relationship. So I think one key implication of the theory is that in order to successfully manage the rivalry, the US needs to somehow cede status to China, at least in Asia. That is to say, at least to give up at least some degree. Well, I think it would require to give up the gold primacy in Asia. This is very difficult for it to do for at least two reasons. The first is that few countries will willingly cede status, least of all the current dominant power. And second is that it requires the condition of empathetic policies from China, which is by no means easy to obtain. So what I think would be important in considering the implications of a Harris administration or second Trump administration is their attitudes toward the question of merit-based fairness in the relationship and the corresponding policies that they will adopt. I think the worst outcome would be a situation where China perceives its relative merit as increasing and therefore seeks status gains based on a sense of entitlement, while the US perceives its relative merit as decreasing and therefore adopts confrontational policies to prevent state loss based on an outdated belief in its primacy. I'll stop here. I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. I think your intervention in combination with Dr. Foulon's insights may be an answer to Professor Jørgensen's criticism that neoclassical realism lacks a robust system-level analysis. It almost seems like it is ignoring the third image. Because here we see that Dr. Foulon is introducing permissiveness as a variable that could be considered, and you are introducing merit-based fairness as another variable that both of them could explain power transition in the international system. So we're coming back to Professor Rose's initial assessment, how neoclassical realism could be not exactly a theory, but something that could combine several elements from other theories, like, for example, neorealism that lacks this level of analysis, in order to produce this kind of wholeness in the realist research program that could explain foreign policy processes, distribution of power in the international system, and global order transitions. So this is what I'm gathering so far from the discussion. So we're turning it over to Professor Richard Ned Lebow. I'm looking forward to your insights. I left you deliberately last, in order to hear the overall assessment of what we heard so far.
Well, thank you very much, Effie. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be surrounded by such interesting people. They've said so much that I'm going to struggle to limit my remarks and response, but I promise to stay within the allotted time limit. Let me respond mostly to Gideon. I agree completely with his framing of the problem. American international relations and social science more generally was captured by a narrow positivist formulation that aspired and believed it possible to create parsimonious predictive theory. This is, of course, ridiculous. I mean, I think is a fair description of it. It's ridiculous for many reasons, primarily the complexity of the world, which Gideon noted, which leads serious scholars to cast their net further afield and to look at many different things that might shape a country's foreign policy or its response to the foreign policy of another. There's a second factor, which he didn't mention, which I think is equally critical, and it may be where he and I disagree and where classical realism disagrees with neoclassical realism, which is that almost everything that matters is context dependent. Agency, confluence, path dependency, all of these things determine policy. A case in point is this discussion about what will happen depending on who wins the presidency in November's election. I can't help but believe that a Harris administration and a Trump administration will go in very different ways in their policies, in their pursuit of different kinds of capabilities, how they're used, and of course, how they're perceived as others. Most importantly, and this will lead into my discussion of power, that the US ability to influence others rises and falls quite independently of its material capabilities or its power, if you like. I'm going to argue, and I have elsewhere, that material capabilities are only one component or contributor to power, and that power by no means translates into influence. It may be the basis for influence, but influence rests on any number of other things, including diplomatic skill, choosing policies that others see in their interests, convincing them that that's the case. All of these things are terribly important to reduce international relations or foreign policy to power, is to make the same kind of mistake that Ken Waltz and neorealists did in trying to come up with a silver bullet that would explain international relations. To do this, one doesn't need to dismiss the importance of power, but to recognize that what it means, how it's channeled, and how it's used is context dependent. Consider the European Union versus the Middle East. War among Western European states, members of the EU, is utterly unthinkable. This doesn't mean that states don't use, or other actors, non-state actors, what power they have to try to bring about favorable outcomes. But they don't do it by the use or threats of force. Whereas in the Middle East, that is, alas, the accepted practice. So the context in which power exists and is used varies enormously. And this is something that needs to be central to any consideration of international relations. I counted 3 times in his presentation, Gideon referred to the Melian dialogue and the claim by the general representing the Athenian side that the powerful do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. He cites this, as do almost all realists, as if it were Thucydides stating a universal truth. This represents an extremely superficial and misleading reading of the Melian dialogue. So, the Melian dialogue, Thucydides knew that sophisticated readers, and all of his readers when he wrote it were by definition sophisticated, they were a fairly narrow elite, that all of his readers would have read Herodotus's account of the Persian Wars, and they would see the many comparisons that Thucydides was drawing between how the Persians behaved when they told the Athenians that resistance was futile and what the Athenians are now telling the Melians. They would also recognize that, shockingly, the Athenians opened the dialogue by dismissing the need to give any prophecies, any justification for their actions that would square them with the accepted practice of the day. This is, of course, exactly what the Persians did. By doing this, the Athenians are taking themselves outside of the Greek community and behaving as a tyrant. In fact, Thucydides in ancient Greek is using the word arche to describe them as such a tyrant, the kind of words that Herodotus used in describing the Persians. When the Athenians come around to saying that the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must, readers would have recognized that Thucydides is now telling us that the Athenians have become the Persians of their day. What's going on here is that rather than being a description of practice, that statement and the Athenian behavior represents a pathology. The Athenians, by taking themselves outside of the community and pursuing their empire by going to war against the little island of Delos, which is, of course, a prelude to the Sicilian expedition, have lost the ability to calculate intelligently their interests. They're behaving in ways that make them a danger not only to everybody else, but to themselves, ultimately in a way that will make them lose the war. There's a complex story going on here, and realists, instead of trying to understand it, cherry pick quotes out of Thucydides. Another example is the notion that the rise to power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta made war inevitable. It's not actually what Thucydides says in ancient Greek, and it's intended as a throwaway line, not as an authorial statement. So we have to be very careful in exaggerating the role of power, and even more careful in legitimizing its use in ways which turn out to be self-destructive. If we look at current international relations, we can see that the US and Russia and China, all three of them, are using their power in ways which are inimical to their real interests. We should be asking ourselves not what capabilities they have, not what balance of power there is, but why they're thinking this way and why they're using a particular language to justify what they're doing. And here Thucydides can tell us a lot, but it's not what realists tell us that Thucydides says. In conclusion, I'd like to point once again to this notion of power, that we should understand, again from Thucydides, that power can be seen as the capabilities we have to do things, or it can be seen as the exercise, the use of those capabilities toward different ends. So in ancient Greece, this is distinction between kratos and dunamis, a dynamic in English comes from the latter. And what Thucydides is telling us about the Athenians by the time of the Melian dialogue is that they had an empire that initially was a voluntary one, but over time they have turned it into an oppressive one by virtue of their extracting resources from their allies beyond what they were willing to contribute toward common ends. In doing so, they face rebellion. They believe that if Milos can escape being in the Athenian alliance, then other powers will think they can as well. The Athenians say this to the Melians, which is why they look forward to crushing them. They're actually happier that the Melians resist than give in because they want to make an example of them. Thucydides goes on to tell us that this kind of empire requires the constant use of power and expansion, and ultimately consumes the power that the country has, or the polis, and in the process brings about its defeat. So he's telling a complicated story about power, about different kinds of power, and contrasting them to what happened when Athens was a hegemon, which is an honorific state conferred on you by others for what you have done for the community as a whole, and with it comes the right to lead. But the right to lead requires you to do things that are in the community's interest and to persuade people rather than to coerce them to join you. If you do so, you build common identities, which makes your future leadership even easier to enact. They're two different tales, and realists and classical realists distinguish between them. Finally, what's going on and what distinguishes classical realists from neoclassical and neorealist is that classical realism is rooted in a tragic understanding of political life. It sees that powerful states compare themselves to the gods, believe they can foresee the future, control others and their environment, and end up damaging themselves and losing what power they have. This is a repetitive trope, and it's why Thucydides, I think, tells us that his writing is something that's valuable for all time, because this pattern of hubris keeps repeating itself. This is something that is absolutely central to understanding contemporary international relations, and unfortunately is ignored by other kinds of realists. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lebow. It is, I left you last because I know that you are a passionate classical realist. So this way you could assess the neoclassical realism from a classical realist perspective. At this point, I would like to turn it over to our discussants. So far, we had excellent insights and interventions, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say about what they have heard so far. So I will begin with Alex Reichwein, just to continue his questions now that he has heard all of the speakers. And we will continue with the other discussions as well. Alex?
Okay, can you hear me? That's great. Yeah.
Yes.
Given that I already had the chance to put some questions and comments to the floor, I will make it very briefly in order to let the others speak, and also to give the audience a chance to put questions and to have an interactive dialogue. So, one brief comment to all of the speakers. Michiel and also Feng, you both from different perspectives within neoclassical realism, I think, different starting points, different understandings of what should be added on the power as a main or as the most important variable. You both work on the U.S.-China relations, and I think there's a lot of questions about this in the audience. It's about status seeking and the conflict which is inherent into a status seeking for both superpowers in the South Chinese Sea or in East Asia and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that the US-China power relations as a bilateral relationship is a very good case for this neoclassical realism strand, which deals with international politics and the power competition between two states. It's not so much about the foreign policy of an individual state, but about the power relations between two states, or three states, in this case, two states, and the competition about power and the consequences. So this is, in my understanding, something which fits into the neoclassical realist strand of using the theory to explain dynamics, power shifts in international politics. And I think there are a lot of questions from the audience, so I will just leave it here when it comes to this topic. Knud, Erik, I know your criticism of realism since many years, and you have a lot of points. We have to deal with this. We have to find answers to your criticism. And you always have a very informed, given the history of our discipline, criticism of this eclectic neoclassical realism. I think it's also clear to most of us what it means, that we have to deal with this criticism, and I think Gideon will have a very many points in order to answer to this criticism. I just want to make one point. Even though there are some problems with the neoclassical realist theoretical agenda, and even though there is eclecticism in it, it seems to me that it is very attractive, because at the moment I'm reviewing an article in a very important journal, and I didn't know how many articles have been produced in the last 3 years about South Korean, Iranian, Saudi Arabian, Japanese, Italian, German, US foreign policy from different neoclassical realist perspectives. So this might not, this is not something which convinces you maybe that neoclassical realism has something to offer, but it seems to me that in the community, there is a crowd of colleagues, people, area studies people, IR people, foreign policy analysis people who use it. And if I read your and Asli's article from 2020 correctly, you missed these people and now they are there. Maybe you provoke them to produce literature. That would be a best case scenario, so to say. And this brings me to my last point, Ned's work. I have dealt with Ned's work when I wrote my PhD on Hans Morgenthau. I think, Ned, I can say that I did really read everything you produced about classical realism, about the tragic vision of power politics, and Ned was kind enough to write a foreword to my book about Morgenthau. So I'm again very happy and proud of it, to be honest.
And to your very good book.
Yes, thank you very much. I translated it into English. Maybe you can have another foreword for the English version, but that's another story. I want not to boring people. But let me just put one thing out of your presentation. If I got you right, you say that neoclassical realism deals not enough with agency and with the different ways different actors, maybe individuals, maybe groups in the society, perceive things, use a language as a method of power, use power capabilities. Is it right?
It's not quite what I'm saying. What I'm arguing is that neoclassical realism still seems to have the goal of developing a kind of theoretical and even predictive understanding of international relations, which I don't think you can do.
Okay.
I think it can help explain what has happened, But prediction, no, because everything is so context dependent. The most you can do, and here neoclassical realism could do it, is to make forecasts, which you update on the basis of new information, which would enable you to confirm or change your storylines.
Okay. So I couldn't bring it better into words, so I stop it here, I think, because now it's very clear what your criticism is to me, because there's a lot of actorness in neoclassical realism, but you're struggling with the predictions. That's okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex. Professor Bezenkoskun, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, great debate. So as a political foreign policy analyst from Turkey, so I tried to make sense of all these debates and reflect on Turkish foreign policy after the election. So actually, as Professor Rose highlighted, after the election, we don't expect any change in American power or foreign policy issues. But if the leadership change, we will see a mindset change, maybe more specifically a strategy change. So as far as I see, there are three main foreign policy issues that continue to become top of the agenda items, are also among the main foreign policy issues for the Erdogan presidency in Turkey. So the conflict between Israel-Hamas, Israel-Hezbollah, Iran-Israel, and the continuing war between Ukraine and Russia, and the future of U.S. support to NATO and European security complex are among the American foreign policy agenda items for the coming term that have direct consequences and effects on the Ankara's foreign policy agenda. As Prof. Foulon a little bit mentioned, now among the European officials, there are worries about what a second Trump administration would mean. And on the other hand, Israeli officials, I'm sure they worried about whether Harris will win and will maintain the level of support for the Israel. And now if you look at the Turkish officials, so they have really good reasons to worry about in both cases. So both the prospect of Trump administration support to Israel and the Harris administration possible indifference to Turkey may cause worries about the Turkish foreign policy makers. So when you think about the regional position, Turkey now struck in the middle of the war zones, Ukrainian war on the north, and the prospect of the grim prospect of a regional conflict in the south, Turkey has surrounded with instability and conflict. So Ankara needs an American administration that could be relied upon. So regarding the previous experiences, Erdogan has more positive experience with Trump compared with Biden, and Biden administration tendency to undermine Ankara in the region cooled the relation between the Turkey and the US. So, for example, this unresolved F-35 purchase of Turkey marked two countries' relations during the Biden administration, and the Biden administration has been one of the rare periods in which relations and dialogue between the two countries have been at minimum level. Now, surrounded by regional conflicts and war, Ankara needs to revitalize the relations with Washington, D.C. So since the beginning of Erdogan's leadership and the Justice Development Party, Turkish foreign policy became a perfect case of neoclassical realist argument. So most of the foreign policy analysts who analyze Turkish foreign policy use neorealism because the divide between foreign policy and domestic policy has gradually disappeared. And the leadership is an important factor in drawing out the main contours of Turkish foreign policy. And foreign policy become a legitimization strategy for domestic front for the Erdogan leadership. So Erdogan and his wingmen repeatedly point out that how costly is securing borders of country against the transboundary threats, namely mostly terrorism and irregular migration. And Turkey's position is one of the most challenging regions of the world have blamed for the economic problems, domestic instabilities, high inflation rates in the country. So President Erdogan needs consolidation of his constituency for a coming possibility of a coming election, maybe possibility of the constitution change. So in this regard, he needs every little help from the new U.S. administration to reclaim actually Turkey's position as the regional power in the Middle East. So the rift between Turkey and Europe has been pushing Ankara to seek new alliances in the East. So yesterday Erdogan was at the BRICS meeting, which was an attempt to balance the lack of Western angle in Turkey's international affairs and foreign policy. So in this regard, new American administration's direction in the transatlantic security, the U.S. support to Ukraine, and the new president's strategy towards Israel aggression in Gaza and Lebanon will have direct effects on Ankara foreign policy and President Erdogan's efforts to consolidate his leadership. So these are all the things on my mind when I was listening to your presentation. Maybe my question could be to Professor Zhang and Professor Gideon, that the Chinese-American competition actually, how this competition affects the Middle East, middle powers in the system from a classical neo-realism point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Bazen. I will turn it over to Professor Feridas Jørgensen.
Hello, thank you so much. So thank you all for all these insightful contributions and also for participating in today's discussion. So I would like to actually discuss the first image, the Kenneth Walt's first image, which is the leader perceptions and their agencies, and also the impact of these agencies on the international relations. So even though Professor Rose says that the power capabilities and also the philosophy and also foreign policy of the US will be the same even after the elections, don't you see that that there are different ways of executing this power, which would affect the balance of power internationally, or as Ned Lebow says, how power is channeled? So, of course, as we consider these potential policy shifts with each candidate, it is clear that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have distinct visions for the future of U.S. foreign policy. Like if we understand that from Harris talks that she likely envisions a multilateral approach or fostering cooperation with NATO, balancing competition and collaboration together with China, supporting global climate initiatives, or prioritizing alliances to stabilize the Middle East. But when we look at Trump, conversely, he would probably pursue a more isolationist strategy, including economic deterrence against China, and reducing NATO obligations, and also prioritizing energy independence over climate action, and obviously a pragmatic approach to Middle Eastern engagements. So, so far okay, but while these potential changes are noteworthy, actually, I would like to highlight something. I would like to be the devil's advocate here. And another dynamic often overlooked is the strategic use of artificial intelligence. So for the time being, it's used for, during the campaigns, but probably and most possibly in the future for political decision makings. So when we look at the campaigns, both candidates have leveraged AI for tailored voter engagement, strategic opponent analysis, and personalized communications, but their approaches actually reflect differing attitudes here. Because when we look at Harris, her campaign employs AI with little bit more careful consideration of ethical implications, often emphasizing transparency and democratic accountability. And her stance suggests that in governance, she would use AI to augment social programs, public services, aiming to improve maybe equity and maintain still regulatory oversight on AI. So Harris has voiced support for AI-driven tools to enhance public welfare, but advocates for regulation to prevent misuse or bias. But when we look at Trump, his approach is pragmatic, also focused on AI's potential to secure an economic and competitive edge, particularly in technology and defense. And he emphasizes the benefits of AI-driven efficiency, favoring fewer regulatory constraints, and believes AI strategic will also bolster US economic and military dominance. So in a Trump administration, we would likely to see an emphasis on using AI for economic policy and defense strategies, with less oversight on its applications, particularly in areas that enhance national competitiveness. So this growing reliance on AI for campaign strategies and obviously for public policy hints at a shift in political behavior itself. So beyond campaign season, AI's integration into decision-making raises critical questions about the autonomy of political leaders, or as Professor Jørgensen says, on the first image in the system. So with AI systems supporting nearly instantaneous data analysis, behavioral insights, and predictive modeling, so one might ask, to what extent will AI influence independent thought and strategic flexibility in leadership? So in what ways might the rapid availability of AI-derived insights shape or constrain a decision of leaders' decision-making autonomy, and how might that change the interaction with the other actors? So we must consider the broader implication of this AI-enhanced political behavior on global dynamics as well. So I want to ask to the speakers, how do you foresee AI integration in leadership and agencies affecting the long-term nature of international relations, where strategic calculations, alliances, and realpolitik decisions may increasingly depend on algorithmic input? Can we talk about a structural change in the international system through the change of the tools of leadership through AI? So that's, I just wanted to ask. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley. Very important, your observations about AI, definitely something to be discussed and taken into consideration for foreign policy process, and also in security governance now. It's going to be very important, and the change in the nature of war. And of course, it's going to play out in the American elections, as I'm sure it played before. So now I would like to turn it over to Carmen Chas Bartolome. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Then well, thank you for inviting me, first of all. And it was a very, very interesting discussion, especially given the very different interjections that I got to listen to, which was very enjoyable. And then I think I will follow Alex's example and limit my intervention to a few questions on a few topics that I found particularly interesting, and I would be quite keen, at least personally, to see expanded upon a bit, and to give more time for questions later on as well from the audience. And then first of all, to Erik, then I was wondering if I could ask you to expand more on the point you made on neoclassical realism being a bit of an empty signifier, in the sense that it's being perpetually theorized, and whether it's an exclusive challenge that neoclassical realism faces, or whether it's something that it also afflicts other theoretical traditions as well. To Feng, I wanted to ask whether you could touch on a bit more on, and it was a very brief mention towards the start of your contribution, whether you could touch a bit more on Confucian realism and whether it brings specifically to the table in terms of what is different about it, or I found that particularly interesting and I hadn't really run into that term before. So that's my question. And then two slightly related questions first to Gideon in relation to your point on realism being very much a hedgehog theory in the sense that it does power very well and uses power as the starting get-go point. Why only power? And what about ethical and moral factors then? And I ask mainly because I've been running into a lot of classical realist literature, especially recently, in relation to the role ethics and morality can play in international relations. And then two very similar related points, finally, to Ned. On what other factors should we consider in addition to power when looking at international relations when analyzing it, or to view it in a more nuanced way? And though you expanded on it quite a bit already, but I'd be quite interested in hearing you talk more about it, then how much harm has cherry-picking quotes from more classical texts like Thucydides, so there's a couple more, how much harm has that done to realism as a theory or a tradition, and what misunderstandings has it potentially led to? And I'll finish here.
Thank you, Carmen, very much. And last but not least, I know you have a lot to say. Mateusz Filaritzes-Panik, please.
The problem is my neighbor started drilling. And I'm afraid it would be barely intelligible what I have to say, unfortunately.
Is there any comment, any question that you would like to pose to the speakers? Maybe just a short question.
Like, I don't know how bad the background noise is, honestly.
We do not hear anything.
I can't even hear it, actually.
No,
you cannot? Okay, okay then. It seems I get
I think you should proceed as you have done, because your sound is perfect.
That's splendid.
Yes.
Yeah, because I have moved and like there is a lot of decorating all over the other flats. So, okay, so to Professor Zhang, I have a question. Is this differentiated status hierarchy as a social system in any way, shape, or form similar to anarchy, married with some kind of a distribution of capabilities? I don't know. I had this analogy, and I would like you to comment on that. And the second thing is, I didn't catch it, but you were talking about the merit. Merit before whom? Merit before the emperor, or the heavens, or merit simply as feeling good about yourself? You know, like merit as something as we apprehend. So those are the two questions. The second thing is for Professor Foulon. It's funny how you can read the same book and have a very different feeling about the matters. I'm talking about this idea of strategic environment permissiveness. Yeah? Because for me, instinctively, I feel it's more like a quality of the milieu that is changing in time. In a sense where this permissiveness is the way that modifies the power level of particular power resources. Yeah, so how does it change? Yeah, so it's permissive to one state that have this particular power resource in abundance, but it isn't for the other state that don't have it, right? So that's the second question. The third question is, or rather a comment to Professor Jørgensen about how he mentioned that there were certain scholars thinking it's impossible to create universal theory of international politics. So I would say, well, maybe it all depends on who is teaching you how to theorize. I guess that would be my quip. For Professor Rose, you see in your like the centerpiece of your argument, yeah, that the material and materialistic resources of US power will not change. Okay, but then there are ideational, I would argue, power resources, right? And then this change could be very much influential on the change of the, let's say, aggregate capability or aggregate power. And basically, it's an argument made by other distinguished speaker here. And the last comment I have is to Professor Lebow. All this talking about Thucydides in the context of Melian dialogue and Sicilian expedition reminded me the debate between Nicias and Alcibiades, where they were arguing basically over whether or not the Athenians should go. And honestly, when I think about the topic of today's conversation, so the Trump-Harris election, I really have this strong analogy about the Alcibiades-Nicias debate, but I really have a huge problem to think who in the Trump-Harris duo is Nicias and who is Alcibiades. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And before I ask the speakers to respond to the questions and comments by the discussants, I would like very quickly to make a few points and comments in order to ground a theory into practice and empirical analysis, that this will help us with the discussion and possibly with the questions from the students and scholars in the audience, because I don't feel we have done it, in depth thus far. We focus on the theoretical part. Of course, I need to point out that the strong points of neoclassical realism, that it emphasizes balancing and bandwagoning. And I'm sorry, I'm looking here because I was making notes as everybody was speaking. So states may choose to balance against threats or bandwagon with them based on their internal assessments and calculations, influenced by domestic factors such as political leadership and public support. And this plays out a lot in US and European grand strategy. Leadership and decision-making, the role of political leaders and their decision-making processes, which are crucial in shaping foreign policy, as individual leaders may have distinct worldwide distinct worldwide priorities that affect how states respond to external challenges. And of course, complex interactions. Neoclassical realism, we can say that emphasize the international relations that involve complex interactions between states, non-state actors, and various domestic factors. And this complexity requires a nuanced approach to analyzing foreign policy and international outcomes. So the general thing, I feel from what I heard so far, there are like general areas of interest about foreign policy, grand strategy, and security governance, in which I'm very much interested, like the foreign policy direction that is going to come after the elections, and whether there's going to be a shift in focus that will lead to changes in relationships with key countries that are allies, also of course of the USA, like China, Israel, Iran. And we heard Professor Liebig, he extensively stressed Thucydides trap, and he reminded of Graham Allison's analysis about the rivalry between the US and China, and maybe we can see how this plays out on a regional level. For example, the Eastern Mediterranean, the MENA region, where there is a lot of turbulence right now. and how it's going to affect relationships like the Israeli-Palestinian relationship or the Israel-Iran relationship, and how it's very important for the outcome of the elections. I'm sorry, for the representative that will become president, to stress a more balanced approach in order to reinvigorate dialogue and a diplomatic approach to the conflict instead of the militarized approach. Also, we need to see how neoclassical realism plays out regarding regional security. In my part of the world, for example, we have dyads and triads with many conflicts, Turkey, Cyprus, Greece. We have Israel with Lebanon, Hamas, a non-state actor, and Hezbollah, and of course, the war in Gaza. How it's going to affect counterterrorism and extremism, the energy interests. We see this is very prominent with the war in Ukraine. Something that it wasn't mentioned, but I took a notice, like human rights and democratic movements, which is very important in regional contexts, like the MENA region, and migration and refugee issues, and of course NATO and military alliances. So this is my very, very short intervention, just to make a note of the general themes that could arise in order to ground what we have discussed theoretically so far into the empirical analysis. I would like now to invite the speaker. Excuse me, can you hear me? I would like to invite, yes, I'm sorry about that. I would like to invite the speakers of the roundtable to respond to the questions and comments by the discussants, of course, starting with Professor Rose.
Thank you very much. Great discussion. Thank you, Epi. Thank you, Alex, and everybody who arranged this. This is really a wonderful kind of discussion of which there should be more of, and a great range of speakers and perspectives. So let me start very briefly with Ned, whose presentation I love. We probably agree on a whole lot of actual policy stuff, but theoretically we disagree in very constructive ways. So there's been some people, Cornelia and others, who've been talking about or criticizing neoclassical realism for its indeterminacy and the eclecticism with which it layers on different variables and the sort of lack of theoretical precision and so forth. And I'm very grateful to Ned's presentation because it shows exactly what neoclassical realism does do. In other words, I would say that Ned's comments show why neoclassical realism is both realist and neo. He is correct that classical realism has a much broader set of factors involved. It doesn't limit itself to structural theory and doesn't offer a kind of predictive social science-y mode, and does allow all sorts of things to come in, and it leaves you very indeterminate indeed. And so to people like Cornelia, I would say, if you don't like the imprecision and theoretical indeterminacy of neoclassical realism, because once we start with power, we go on to different things in a somewhat unspecified order, then you really won't like Ned's approach, which can allow everything to come in. And so the realist part of neoclassical realism is the focus on power first, because it does structure other things. And the neo part comes in because it does allow you to have some kind of a framework for putting the blooming buzzing confusion of the world into a package, rather than just saying everything matters and everything is eclectic. So that's why it's neoclassical and why it's power. In terms of the power part, and this is where I would respond to Feng Zhang and others, and the Europeans. The reason we're talking about Chinese perceptions of international politics and why they're making is because there's been a dramatic increase in Chinese material power in the last couple of generations. If there hadn't been a dramatic rise in Chinese material power capabilities, no one would be caring about Chinese views on IR. And if China's material rise peaks, has already peaked, we don't know, but if it has, and if its challenge to the international system does not, in terms of the old-fashioned, pure realist power dynamics, if its military and economic strength does not continue to increase in relative terms, then it will not end up displacing the world order. There won't be a Thucydides trap. There won't be a merit trap. It'll just be a failed challenge to the Western post-war liberal order in the same way that the Soviet Union posed a failed challenge, which ultimately subsided. And for all the Europeans here, Europe represents the flip side of that. Because if there's any region of the world, any set of the world that could really justify the notion of merit, it would be Europe over the last couple of generations, which has managed to transform itself into a human paradise in many respects and transcended much of power politics, focused on individuals, focused on values, brought wonderful things, and at the same time almost completely ignored straightforward, old-fashioned realist material power, and as a result has dropped dramatically in world power rankings, found itself at the mercy of a large, powerful neighbor who could come over and using old-fashioned power to take it, and is having its economy stagnating, and is increasingly becoming an arena of great power politics in the world rather than a player in great power politics. And so I would say that the rise of China and the decline of Europe is related to very old-fashioned material power capability trends, and those things in a good old-fashioned Marxist way. You don't need to go Confucius, you can go to Marx. There will be a material base that will determine an institutional and ideational superstructure, and the U.S. has been able to have this outsized role in the world because of its outsized economic performance and its outsized military performance. And the liberal international order, in many respects, is an epiphenomenon of American material power. And if that material power significantly diminishes over time, then you will see a decline in many of those things as well. So all neoclassical realism, to me, the least it can do is provide a basic framework for discussing trends in power over time and whose voices matter and why. But it can't do much more than that, because then the details all get filled in. And with things like AI, which is a crucially important, interesting question, that will play in power capabilities. And it's precisely why it's becoming a dramatic arena of context. And so, I mean, it seems to me that all we can say is about all we can say about international politics is, what you say about the golden rule: he who has the gold makes the rules. That the material underpinnings of power will dominate the other factors in power in the long run, and other things will play into that material power. It's not just a completely exogenous. I'm more of an endogenous growth theory than a classical solo growth theory. The power will be developed in part for a variety of internal and other reasons. And there's also this question of, as Ned was talking about, how people use the power. So it's not just that China has rising material power in a very straightforward, old-fashioned way. And if that doesn't continue, it won't play as much of a role. But if it does continue, it will. But it doesn't have many particular allies. And the United States has been able to exercise the power and influence that it has, both because of its material power and also because it has used that material power and its soft power in a way that is not predatory, that is not aggressive. And so, yes, if Trump fundamentally abandons much of the way that the United States has made its power compatible with others and a world at large, then the United States will not just will international politics come to a much more dog-eat-dog, old-fashioned competition, but the U.S. ultimately will lose the power that it has, which stems not just from its own material capabilities, but from the alliance and the team that it has created because of the way it has chosen to play the game. And I think that's about all one can say without getting into the detailed analysis, at the theoretical level. Then you get into the detailed analysis of individual cases and individual issues, which we don't have time for. I'll shut up now.
Thank you very much, Professor Rose. Dr. Foulon?
Yeah, Effie, could I interrupt?
Of course.
I'm going to have to leave. So could I speak for a few minutes?
Of course, please, Professor Liebig. Yes, thank you.
If I may, and then I can go. Thank you for that, and thank you, Gideon, for your interesting response. I have two observations about what you said. Some of your argument was in defense of the role of material capabilities. Some of your argument seemed to me was in defense of the United States and its high defense spending. That the one doesn't necessarily follow from the other. Your foreign policy analysis seemed to me standard American national security foreign policy analysis that sees the world from a very particular American perspective and also sees Europe and China from that perspective. I don't agree with you, but I won't go into the details of it. Let me just stay for a moment with the neoclassical realism focus. Nobody's trying to deny that material capabilities are important, and you're absolutely right in arguing that China and the United States are great powers because of their military, because of their material capabilities. But that's only the first step in making an analysis. The second is, what do they do with their capabilities? States make all kinds of choices about how they should spend them. The Europeans have made different bets than the Americans and spent them in different ways. I think it wrong to dismiss out of hand what the Europeans have done, and also to describe them at the mercy of the Russians, which I think is a gross exaggeration of both Russian capabilities and minimizing what would happen should the Russians attack a NATO member. To me, one of the striking things, and I'll pose it as a question and leave it as that, the United States is unquestionably the most powerful state the world has ever seen. However, over the course of time, it has become less and less and less able to persuade others to do what it wants. There's a contradiction here. Military capabilities and material capabilities, rather than producing influence, have actually undermined it, given the way the United States has used its power. This is an important substantive and theoretical question. I'm not suggesting it can't be addressed by neoclassical realism, but it's not being addressed by realists of any stripe other than classical realists. I invite you to join in to this debate and offer your own understanding of why this has happened. The other point I'd like to make, the question was raised about ethics. And of course, crude realism. And I don't think anybody here is a crude realist, so I'm not tilting at any of you when I make this remark. Crude realists think that ethics stops at the water's edge. All sophisticated realists, Hans Morgenthau, John Hertz, E.H. Carr, one can go through the list, recognized that policies that are seen as ethical by others are more likely to succeed than those that are not. I've written extensively on this. And secondly, a state's foreign policy, as both Hans Morgenthau and Thucydides made clear, reflects and should be consistent with its domestic values. And serious problems arise when it's not. So for both these reasons, and they're practical reasons, but also philosophical or ethical reasons, for both of them, we need to engage with ethics. And being a realist should make one more rather than less aware of it. So I thank you all very much and wish you all well. And thank you, Effie.
Thank you, Professor. It's a great honor always to host you. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Foulon, would you like to address maybe?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for all of the comments and all the discussion. Of course, there's way too much to discuss, so I will just do 3 brief points. One of them is a very brief one, which was about some discussion about power transition theory, of power transitions, more specifically also with Feng Zhang's presentation. Here, of course, comes to mind, I think, that the interest I also have myself in NCR, but also from baseline, not per se of Walsen structural realism, but also from the AFK Organsky type of power transition theory as a baseline that may tell us much about this kind of question. So just as a side note that I'm very much interested in those debates. Two more detailed comments. One of them is, or one more at least, is about the question about AI that I found really intriguing, that was mentioned just a second ago. So my understanding is that AI, or also emerging technologies in general, there's a big dearth of studies on AI when it comes to the Neoclassical Realist body of research, to the extent that we have comprehensive reviews of what NCR what has been published on NCR, for example, the 2016 book, but also recent studies with one of my co-authors, Justus. We're keeping a database on NCR publications. We have about 300 so far. We aim to do a bibliometric study on that next year. There's similarly none that we identify, at least as NCR, that is doing emerging technologies or AI and so on. There are a few, but a handful on cyber studies, for example, who that's mainly from cyber specialists who then draw on NCR, maybe 2 or 3 that I know of. But that big dirt is there. So on the question that was raised about what is the effect there on decision-making, foreign policy and strategy of AI, so that I think I can only think about a few ways to move forward about this debate. And one of the first, I think, observation would be that it's not surprising, obviously, in my view, that IR theory, and in this case NCR, doesn't have much on this topic yet, given the lag time that I think exists between the development of technologies and then their transition into social sciences in general, from exact sciences to social sciences. Just like nuclear weapons technology was first in the 1950s and 60s, on more by exact scientists and so forth, and only then found their way into the social sciences. And I think in this way as well, and I'll post in the comments later an article that I just did with Gustav Meybauer in Contemporary Security Policy on cyberspace. There is also lag time between the development of cyberspace, for example, and I think the same goes on with AI studies by more tech-capable social scientists and IRs and political science scholars, and then the time by when this translates into the more generalizable IR theory debate. I think we are currently at this kind of nexus, or this kind of transition point between these two, if you want, epistemic communities. I think that's not an uncommon thing that we are at this point now. And some of those emerging technologies debates, like the cyber debates, I think there's so much being published on that. In international affairs, there has been a piece that came out it's coming out next month in November, about the development of cyber conflict studies. And there's lots of being published on it, but not in the top journals. Most of them are being published, not in the top 20 journals, depending on the rankings we use for the journals. So that's one indication of a vibrant community on these technology debates, but not in the generalizable, more disciplinary journals that we find there. But I think a first observation as to why there's a challenge, and I think where the question came from, what the role of AI is. So my 2 cents on how to start thinking about this is there is maybe, I guess, 2 ways that we find also, I think, in the history of IR, but also today about we can look at the role of technology. One of them is as technology as more of a unit level thing, whether it's a tool that can be deployed as a tool of statecraft, whether it's a capability that can be added to a state's material capabilities. In this case, for example, the role of semiconductors, advanced semiconductors, chips and servers and these kind of things. But more as a unit level kind of thing, so a tool that states can leverage, perhaps similar in the way of nuclear weapons technology can be seen as a tool of statecraft. The other way, of course, is also, that's not a new thing, but that's, I think, a useful way to think about emerging technologies is the notion of a structural modifier, which we also know from not just realism, but also the English school. And I think Glenn Snyder's chapter in the 1996 edited volume on the restatement of realism is a good discussion there. And that doesn't see technologies of all other factors as just a unit level factor, but more as a factor that affects all systems in all states in the international system. Just of course, as a role of nuclear weapons technology is the prime example there with the mutually assured destruction principle and then the stability-instability paradox. So in that way, there's also a way to looking at emerging technologies, and in this case, AI and cyberspace, as maybe also a systemic factor, not just a unit level attribution or a tool that states can use or a domain through which they can conduct offensive cyber operations or something like that, but also as a factor that maybe changes. So that's, I think, a question for inductive research by saying, what is the role of AI, for example, on decision making? And then the question is it just affecting one state? So maybe a handful of states, more advanced Western developed countries may have the capabilities to develop AI, but because it exists, then maybe it has more systemic-wide implications and maybe affects the decision-making more in general. And I think that the language of, the existing language of the IR field, also beyond NCR, of structural modification is a really useful avenue that can be adopted there. And I think I'll post the treatment we have on this in the chat, but there's also Glenn Snyder's article in 1996. There is the 2016 book that is on NCR that discusses structural modification. There are a number of ways there. I guess the challenge there is to balance inductive with deductive research, because in my understanding, if you want to move forward on the AI debate and the technologies debate, we can't just rely mostly or solely on deductive reasoning based on existing theories when these technologies are so new and we simply don't know what they're doing and they're being developed in the private sector and so on. So a good balance, I think, between deductive and inductive research, I think, would be a way forward there. Interestingly, of course, depending on the balance of inductive and deductive research, it is very much inductive research. The question, of course, is what kind of theory will come out of it on decision making? Will that particular theory that is inductively theorized still be NCR? That is, of course, I think what the data may tell us. And then I think everything else on these debates falls into existing views on emerging technologies and technologies in general. Are they revolutionary in terms of the practice of IR and the study of IR, so and thus IR theory and NCR, which means do they overturn everything we know, or are they only moderately affecting decision-making processes in the case of, for example, AI or cyberspace? And I think there has been a wave, of course, of the more revolutionary side of things, that we can have a cyber war and these kind of things. Then, of course, we had this kind of different wave of studies on emerging technologies and on AI and cyberspace by saying, actually, maybe the effect is more moderate, in a sense of maybe AI and cyberspace and cyber offensive operations do not have an independent strategic effect, but only in combination with other tools of statecraft, or that cyber tools and AI may by themselves not be decisive in conflict. There was by Erik a piece in International Security arguing precisely that point. So I think these two groups are still kind of debating, they still exist and are still vibrant, but I think both the revolutionary and the moderate viewpoints on this and the structural modification argument, I think is an interesting way forward. So I'll post it in the comments what I have on this myself. And then as a final point on Matthäus' comment about the permissiveness point, I think it's an excellent comment. I will also take it into the revisions probably of the book and the article when they come back, that the state's position in terms of their power capabilities will also affect to what extent they consider the environment to be permissive or less permissive. Because in the same geographical region, let's say North America or let's say Europe, a very good example there, the very different power positions of a European state may of course affect that as well. So I'll take into account. I don't have an answer to your question, Matthäus, but I'll think it's a good point to add in the revisions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Professor Jørgensen? Professor Knud Erik Jørgensen?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I had time to ask my AI device for some good comments to your very good questions. So the device recommended me to focus on just 3 points. The first one is that I should remind Gideon Rose that Neoclassical Realism was sort of announced as third image plus factors X, Y, and Z. Now, I've listened very carefully, but still after today's roundtable, I have no clue about the global distribution of power, the third image. It's gone, as I sort of criticized. Then my AI device said I should be a little bit careful with my language, but on my own behalf, I would say that that was kind of disappointing, that I didn't get sort of a good overview about how the configuration of power, whether material or ideational, looks right now. I learned something about US, China, but what about the other great powers? How do they configure? And what does that mean for what they are likely to do? So that was the first comment that I was suggested to give. The second one is that, and that is to Carmen's very good question about the empty signifier, which of course is as bad as it gets, right, for a theoretical perspective to fall that deep into just an empty signifier. I think it seems to me that neoclassical realism is not the only perspective that has sort of had that fate. It doesn't have a monopoly. My AI device suggested that I should point to practice theory, where the first book on that kind of theory pointed out that there are at least 17 different understandings what a practice is. And with 17 different understandings of what practice is, it's quite difficult to theorize. So that is one. A second candidate is, I was reminded by my device that Alex Wendt once commented about constructivism, that it reminded him about an American science fiction movie called Le Blob. It was about this movie about a gluey unit that came in from outer space. And during its movement, it simply consumed everything into the same, which he said was constructivism. During the 1990s, everybody became constructivists of different sorts. So maybe that's also one of these sad cases of a theoretical perspective that had become an empty signifier, because it can mean anything and everything. It depends on who you ask. A third example I was reminded by my device is, well, it goes back to a wry Italian who once commented on the English school and asked, and that was a rhetorical question, what is the English school if not just realism plus sociology minus economics? Let's, of course, then, yeah, what comes out of this construction, right? Okay, at least it's not economics. So far, there's a demarcation. But realism plus sociology, okay, that gives quite a few possibilities. Then the final comment, the third comment is that about this eclecticism. I guess it is something about balancing theoretical ambition on the one hand and enjoying analytical freedom on the other hand. Because yes, you can do sort of a Kenneth Walsh exercise and you can come up with some very, very ambitious theoretical construction. But the traction it has among fellow scholars was limited. There were not that many neorealists, and they became fewer and fewer over time. Whereas the eclectic analytical perspectives, well, it even got praised by Peter Katzenstein back in 2010, where he said, well, when you look at a certain topic, yeah, you can pick and choose. and you can put them together in a very excellent fashion. It can also be completely rubbish, so there's no guarantee of success. But eclecticism is, yes, it's definitely an option. And it seems to me that is what neoclassical realism has to offer. A framework where all sorts of factors and variables can be sort of drawn in, downloaded into your analysis of a concrete problem or issue. And it depends on your analytical skills whether that makes sense or not. If it does not, then your reviewers of your article or the book, of course, will tell you. But sometimes, yes, there's a lucky strike, and it all goes up into something synthesized out of these different components. So I guess, again, if you're into games, play games, then yeah, go for it. And go for eclecticism. But it may not sort of pay off. That's the risk. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor.
On behalf of me and my device.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zhang?
Yes, thank you very much. This is a fantastic roundtable and excellent comments. I've learned a lot from all the participants, and there are very excellent questions directed at my presentation too. I'll quickly start with the question of the role of power, which is understood as material capabilities in realist theory, including neoclassical realism. I would say that in the approach that I'm developing to try to explain the making of U.S.-China rivalry, material capabilities serves as a very important condition, but is not essential explanatory variable. And of course, I very much appreciate Professor Rose's comment that had it not been the rise of Chinese material capabilities, we wouldn't be so stressed about China these days. I think that is obviously, of course, true. Although I would say that an excessively weak China is also a huge problem. But that's a different question. I think what I am pointing to is I by no means dismiss the central role of material capabilities, but I think equally important, if not more, is how that capability is exercised and how that exercise is perceived by others. And in the U.S.-China relationship is, of course, the important question is how U.S. policymakers perceive China's use of its rising capabilities. So one of the things, one of the striking developments in U.S.-China policy, for example, is the flip from an open position of welcoming China's rise as late as during the Obama administration to the current position, which is really, at least is widely perceived inside China, is trying to contain China's rise. So U.S. officials, U.S. leaders are no longer saying that the U.S. welcomes China's rise, whereas President Obama stated that many times, especially during his first term. So what caused this change of attitude? If you look at the Chinese material capabilities, it's you can argue whether it's peaked or not, but I think it's still more or less an upward trajectory, and the speed has gone down, but power is still there. And so I would point to how China has exercised that capability as manifested in its foreign policies. That is why in my theory, in my framework, I try to include a variable of relational empathy as manifested in how you understand whether you have an adequate appreciation of the other side's interests and needs, and to what extent that kind of appreciation is reflected in actual policy. And quickly moving on to other questions. Confucian realism. I mentioned them in my talk. It may sounds a bit bizarre to you, but actually, it's not an outlandish idea. I mean, my main version of Confucian realism is still in development, so I wouldn't say too much about it. But I would point you to a very interesting theory that has emerged out of China over the past nearly two decades or so. It's called moral realism. Actually, I coined that term in a review article of Professor Yan Shetong at Tsinghua University, who is arguably China's most important IR scholar. So he used to be my head of department, so we were colleagues. So I wrote that in a review article of his book, Asian Chinese Power, Asian Chinese Thought, Asian Chinese Thought, Modern Chinese Power. And the subsequently published a couple of other books as well. It's widely regarded as original Chinese contribution to IR theory. So I would point you to that. On the question of, I discussed this notion of differentiated hierarchy and whether it's similar to anarchy. I would say it's the opposite of the idea of anarchy. I think hierarchy is now a major topic of research among IR scholars. Very few people are talking about anarchy these days because anarchy, especially in the Waltzing version, is widely rejected as an analytically useful concept. And finally, there's a question of merit. Merit before whom? Well, in the U.S.-China relations, that I'm studying, it is the mutual perception of each other's merit. The basic theoretical argument I'm making is actually based on common sense, whether the U.S. deserves to be in such an elevated status, that is such an elevated role vis-a-vis China. And from the U.S. side, the question is whether China deserves to attain a higher status and greater regional and global role. I think it is quite important to explain the deterioration of the deteriorating relationship between the two countries. And I would say this merit, which I find is quite an interesting concept. I drew it from Confucian thought. I think it has the potential to explain something that the puzzle that Ned has mentioned, namely, the U.S. is still very powerful, but it seems, less and less capable to solve many of the world's problems, and its global standing has declined in the eyes of many countries of the world. I think, the concept of merit and associate theories have the potential to explain this puzzle. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. I would like to kindly ask all participants of today's event to extend the event for just 10 minutes, because, for example, I see that Professor Cornelia Navari is in the audience. It's a great honor. Thank you, Dr. Navari, for attending our event today. And she had so many comments, and she wanted to intervene. She was writing her comments, so I would like to give her the floor to pose her questions or her thoughts, her comments. I saw that you had many comments in the chat. And, I would like to listen to your perspective and anything that you would like to add to this discussion. It would be a great honor for us. Thank you. We cannot hear you, your microphone.
Sorry, thank you for the invitation. My comments have been rather liberally expressed already. Yes, I am struck. I'm going to follow Knud Erik in expressing somewhat perplexity that we haven't talked very much about the actual distribution of power. We haven't specified what kind of power. We've been very neglectful of structure in a theory which is supposed to be about structure. And it seems to me that this concern with the variables has inevitably led people away from structure to agency and to foreign policy. And this seems to me to be what's happening. Everyone is using critical neoclassical realism to make very interesting examinations of different countries' foreign policy. And that's okay. That's okay. What was my last point was about this. Now what you have is a basis, really interesting basis for an understanding for foreign policy analysis, nice comparative studies to make a foreign policy, which is of course the real meaning of a social science is comparative study and coming to conclusions on the basis of, really good evidence. But of course, that's not what the neoclassical realists want to do. That would be, I think, my main conclusion that I draw from this. So I do appreciate Michael's last point when he's talking about the framework to think about cyberspace and emerging technologies. He's looking at the structure again. He's gone back to structure. Quite right. You got to go back to structure. And so you got to be careful, you neoclassical realists, that you just drift away. That's basically what I would have to say following this. But it's been a very enjoyable, I must say, session. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. And it's an honor to have you in the audience. And also, I think Mr. Thomas had the question because he persistently raised his hand, but unfortunately I couldn't ask him to pose his question. Mr. Thomas, if you are with us and you would like to pose your question, thank you.
I am. Thank you so much. It wasn't much of a question other than the comments I posted as time went on in the chat itself. I'd like to just thank everybody. And I've been following this institute and joining you guys for conferences for the last 3 or 4 years. I'm not sure anymore. I'm getting old. But I would say that this is one of the most fantastic panels we've had, and one of the most honorable ones, I'd say, because the diversity of perspectives, even if I weren't a realist, which I am and have been for all of my academic career since my BA, I'm already on my PhD, and I've always been a realist. I've always also rejected the behavioralist challenge of, following those scientific or pseudoscientific pretensions that, say, neo-realists or even neoliberalists have so thoroughly accepted. That being said, those contributions are worthwhile. At times, Kenneth Waltz is simply, not easily ignorable in our eye, and that's a good thing. But I will say that these contributions are just so diverse and so enriching, and I feel like we've talked more about realism and realisms than the US elections per se, but perhaps that's far more interesting. It might be, because at the end of the day, the elections themselves are quite conjunctural, right? They're contextual, much more so than the somewhat semi-permanent-esque aspects a lot of you were discussing before. So in a way, I think this was even more enriching than what I had expected it to be. And let me tell you, FEA, thank you again by the way, for hosting and contributing to the organization of this event, because as always, everybody did a great job, and I'm just honored to be here, even though my camera's turned off today. But I'm just honored to be here. It's such a massive privilege that you guys do this for free with such distinguished speakers and scholars and professors. So that's pretty much all I had to say. As for questions and comments, I left them on the chat. I know some people have read them, some might have not, and many of the comments were left here by many, and they're all so insightful and so, so relevant as contributions to what we were discussing here. And by the way, thank you everybody who posted articles and links for delving deeper into these topics. Indeed, they are quite enriching, and I'll be sure to check them out when I get the time and the chance, and hopefully when my brain allows me to do so. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and for your participation always and your kind comments. I personally truly appreciate it. Yes, we didn't have the time to delve deeper into the American elections and how foreign policy will go, like in specific areas, like for example the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the war in Gaza, Ukraine, what is going to happen with EU strategy, maybe the conflict in the South China Sea, because everybody was so overwhelmed by the theory. We're all theorists here, and we had the honor to host some of the greatest theorists that exist right now in this field of study. In the realist research program, and budding also up and coming, scholars. So we got so overwhelmed by the theoretical analysis. I was hoping that we will have the time to ground it into the empirical analysis afterwards, but of course time flies. Really quickly, I would like just to honor our audience and the students who had who stayed all this time with us. I would like to read two questions. One question, I'm sorry, by Huma Sadiki, if I pronounce it right. How neoclassical realism will make account of path dependency of USA political parties' behavior? If one of you would like to answer this question really quickly. I think maybe Professor Rose would like to answer it, or somebody else.
Right now we have two parties in the U.S. One is sort of a fairly normal, legitimate party, which will continue in its basic course. The Democrats, one an increasingly radicalized personality cult, which we just have no idea. So basically about the election, it's probably good we didn't talk about it too much because it's too depressing. But basically, very simply, you have four scenarios very quickly. You have if Harris wins, you'll get a continuation of existing policy. If Trump wins, you have three alternatives. The first is a possible some version of the first term in which much of this is just talk, and you go about in a sort of like the first term. Second Trump possibility is he actually does what he says he's going to do, and you have a much bigger break. We just don't know the possibility about that. Half the people voting for Trump like him because they say he will do what he wants, what he says, and the other half say, oh, don't worry, he's not going to do what he says. We have no clue until we actually see what happens. And the third possibility is you get Trump, but he continues his decline, maybe dies, and then pretty soon you're in a J.D. Vance presidency, which is actually interesting because he's smarter, more capable, and somewhat less radical than Trump. And so that could be a more competent version of a somewhat more moderate, but still very aggressively America First type policy. We just don't know. And this is the kind of thing where IR theory can't tell you all that much, except the basic structure will be the same. There's a lot of ruin in an order and a lot of ruin in an empire, but over time, the things can change.
Can I just interject for 20 seconds to ask you? Yes, to ask you, Professor Gideon, since you're an American, and to all Americans out here, I don't know if anybody else in here is American. I'm Portuguese, so I can't really speak for Americans. But I would ask you if you think that the quote-unquote team that Trump is trying to assemble for ministerial positions or maybe cabinet level positions, we're talking Elon Musk, Tulsi Gabbard, what are the other, Vivek Ramaswamy, all those people and many others I'm probably forgetting about, J.D. Vance, of course, and somebody else whose name I forgot, but, maybe Kennedy as well, perhaps, albeit in a different capacity. How do you feel that might change, foreign policy as a whole? Yes, considering that team.
Except for Vance, everybody you mentioned is insane. So it would change dramatically, but I don't think anybody except Vance will actually play a major role. And we just don't know. If Trump wins, we'll have to look to the personnel to see, because Trump world is full of nut jobs and cronies and weirdos, but it's all, and he will have to draw on he will want to draw on some of those, but he'll have to draw on some others. And we just don't know how radical a second Trump term will be. And anybody who says they know is kidding themselves. So we'll just have to hope that doesn't happen and then see how it actually plays out when it does. And this is the kind of contingency that IR theory can't actually tell you. It can just tell you something about the big, broad framework within which that will play out.
Thank you. I also see that there was an excellent discussion going on in the comments by also the participants, and thank you very much with members of the audience. Amazing comments with a lot of resources for the students, so we truly appreciate that. If there is no other question really quickly, especially by a student, which I don't see a hand raised, I would like to thank all participants so very much. Thank you so much, the speakers in the roundtable, the discussants. We're truly honored to have hosted you and to listen to your insights and everything you had to say. And we're looking forward to hosting you again in another event. Maybe, we're going to continue this kind of events and discussing not only the realist research program, but also venturing into the research programs of other theoretical frameworks. So thank you very much. We're very honored. Thank you very much to the scholars and the students and the researchers who were in the audience and stayed with us for so long. We're truly honored by your participation. I don't know, before I close, if the roundtable speakers and the discussants would like to say something. If you would like, please.
Just a big thank you to everyone for their great contributions, both people supporting or talking in support of the framework, but the critics as well, Cornelia's point about the need to stress more structure and so on. So thank you so much for the great discussion. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Well, and with that, we came at the end of this event.
Professor Alex wants to speak, I believe.
Oh, yes, please.
Just a quick idea. Maybe in the next workshop, Cornelia can argue why English school is not just realism plus something.
Of course.
Which was mentioned by Knud Erik, because we had this book series with Pembroke on the European traditions in IR, as you all know. And Cornelia Navari did not only a monograph about the English school, but also an edited volume about the European roots, traditions, origins about the English school. This is something we do not discuss in the context of youth policy for sure, but there is a diversity of lectures and workshops we want to offer in this under the host of the EER in Athens, and Effie and her colleagues, which do a great job in producing posters, doing all this organizational stuff. So thank you very much. As part of the organizational team, I have not so much work because Effie is doing all this work and all the organization.
Not only me. Thank you, Alex, but of course I'm collaborating with you and I'm very honored and very grateful, especially with you and with Ashley and Bezen. We're good friends. We're also publishing together. We're co-editors in a book that is coming out. So I'm really honored by your help as a junior scholar. I'm really honored and I mean it. And Professor Navari, now you have an open invitation by us for the next event, so please consider it. We'll be in touch with you. With Professor Gideon Rose, he's going to become a permanent, participant in our events. We already have become, we love you, if I may say that. Your point of view, your kindness, your generosity always. So thank you very much.
I'm going to be in Berlin for the spring, so I hope to learn much more about European politics and attitudes and be corrected in all my horrible American arrogance, etc.
Yeah, great. Half of us are attending the ISA in Chicago, so if you are going to be there, we should get together, Professor Rose. Okay, great. So with that, we came to the end of this event. Until next time, I wish everybody has a good evening, and thank you again so much. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you
so much.